Kant, if you haven't noticed, is really into terminology. When you're reading Kant, it seems like every other word necessitates a reach for the dictionary, or maybe more accurately, when you're reading Kant, it feels like you are already reading the dictionary. In order to pay homage to Kant, then, I thought I would begin the lecture today with a term. My term for the day is parallax. Now, for those of you rapidly reaching for your Cambridge Dictionary of Philosophy, you should know that parallax has nothing to do with philosophy. It is rather an astronomical term. It describes what happens when you look up at a star, move, and then look back up at the same star. When you do this, the star's surroundings seem to change. Maybe, for instance, a star that was on its left is now on its right. Such a phenomenon may sound like it would be a bother for astronomers, but in fact, the precise opposite is the case. Indeed, it is ultimately through parallax that astronomers are able to learn something about a star, learn, for instance, how far away it is and how it is situated relative to the stars around it. One view of a star is not enough to do this. Astronomers need to take into account the changes that go on between various views if they are able to really nail down a star's place in the cosmos. In the reading for today, Kant does something very similar. And no, I don't mean by this that Kant has some hidden astronomical side, that Ursa Major and the Big Dipper are lurking in the subtext of every Kantian murmur. I mean rather that Kant uses the strategy of parallax in his attempt to understand the categorical imperative. If you remember our reading from Monday, you will remember that Kant approached the categorical imperative through our ideas of goodwill and duty. In today's reading, Kant once again sets out in search of the categorical imperative. However, like a mountain climber who decides to attempt an already conquered mountain from a new slope, Kant approaches the categorical imperative in a new way, and not just once, but twice. The reason for all this is similar to the reason the astronomer looks at a star from several locations. Indeed, Kant hopes that by offering three different approaches to the same categorical imperative, we will be able to learn something about it that we couldn't from a single view. So then, let's get our head out of the stars and tackle the reading for today. On page 266, Kant begins his approach to the categorical imperative by asking, what is an imperative? Seems pretty straightforward. If you haven't noticed by now, though, philosophers are not really into answering straightforward questions in straightforward ways. Like that one annoying friend we all have, they prefer to complicate things. And so, in response to his question, Kant says, well, we can't actually understand what an imperative is without first understanding laws, reason, the will, and the way these three things interact. Goodbye, simple question. Hello, doctoral dissertation. To begin then, says the now more familiarly frustrating Kant, laws seem to be those things that are naturally true at all times and in all places. With such a definition, we should be looking out for falling apples, as Kant is obviously stealing the stuff Newton came up with while investigating the laws of motion. We could call Kant out on this, but I'm not going to here. Why? Well, Fig Newton stole something from Newton as well, and the good Lord knows that resulted in something close to perfection. Next item of business, then. What about reason? Reason, Kant claims, is that which is able to discover laws. This seems, well, reasonable. Last, then, the will. The will is for Kant that which guides our action. It is our intention, our motive. Again, this seems both reasonable and consistent with the way Kant has talked about the will in the past. So then, having defined his terms, Kant begins investigating how they relate to each other. Reason, laws, and the will, Kant claims, are supposed to be perfectly intertwined. It's supposed to work like this. Reason discovers the laws. The will then immediately recognizes these laws and acts according to them. The problem is, it doesn't work like this. Why? Well, because, if you haven't noticed, human beings are not entirely reasonable. All you have to do to prove this is take one look at the Darwin Awards, a Monty Python skit, or at people who are able to eat dessert without coffee. Absurd. Due to our irrational side, then, after reason discovers the laws of morality, we don't always allow these laws to direct our will. Instead, we sometimes act out of what we want, out of selfish desires or out of impulses. For instance, we may allow our anger to get the best of us at the local saloon and begin a brawl, even though our reason tells us this is not a good idea, especially since One-Eyed Pete looks ready for a fight and is at least twice our size. This, then, is where imperatives come in. An imperative, you see, is simply an ought statement. Imperatives tell us what we ought to do. What this boils down to, Kant continues, is that if we're going to be ethical, we ought better to start paying attention to our reason. Or, to put it differently, what an imperative does is tells us what needs to happen for a will to line up with our reason. Having thus finally pinned down what an imperative is, Kant begins to break it down a little further. There are, he starts, three types of imperatives, three basic types of ways that our reason ought to line up with our will. The first is a problematic imperative. This imperative tells us how we ought to act to reasonably direct our will in order to achieve some practical goal. For instance, if I want to catch my limit on opening weekend, I ought to get up early and have several kinds of lures and bait ready. Pretty straightforward. The second kind of imperative is also relatively simple to understand, and it's called a pragmatic imperative. This imperative tells us what we ought to do to achieve happiness. For instance, if I want to retire early, I ought to work hard while I'm young. Now Kant notes, while different in context, both of these two types of imperatives have the same form. Both say, if I have such and such a goal, then I ought to perform such and such an action. There's nothing bad with this form. The problem comes in only if we try to say that such a form can give us ethical imperatives. Because, Kant continues, an ethical imperative should be true no matter what. That's what ethics are, steadfast rules to act by. But when what I ought to do depends on a goal I set for myself, then the imperative disappears if and when the goal does. For instance, if I don't want to retire early, all of a sudden there is no reason that I ought to work hard when I am young. So, while there is nothing wrong with these types of imperatives, they are not moral because they depend on the goal you set remaining your goal. Kant thus calls both problematic and pragmatic imperatives hypothetical. Now, however, we have to turn to the third type of imperative, the ethical, moral, and, surprise, categorical imperative. As we have seen, if this imperative is to be ethical, it can't be dependent on any sort of goal I set for myself. Rather, the imperative has to stand alone. This type of imperative must thus be completely pure, not corrupted by goals, but drawn instead from natural law itself, drawn by our reason. It is the imperative that simply says we ought to act according to natural law. But since natural law is applicable to all times and all people, as we have seen, acting according to natural law simply means acting in a way that all people at all times could act. The categorical imperative is an expression of universality itself, saying, and these are Kant words now, that we ought to act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it would become a universal law. Now, even though Kant's argument here is super solid, it still is, of course, fair to ask whether such an ethics is applicable. Kant believes so. He asks us to consider lying in order to get a loan. Is this ethical? Well, Kant says, can you will a law that says everyone at any time can lie to get loans? The answer is a clear no. If everyone could ethically lie to get loans, the entire institution of loaning would disappear. Therefore, the categorical imperative does indeed succeed in telling us what we should do. Now, Kant does approach the categorical imperative one more time, but unfortunately, we will only have to be very brief in covering this approach. I have included a more detailed sketch in my PowerPoint. What the third approach amounts to is this. Every will aims at some desired end, some goal. Now, the goal for a hypothetical imperative, as we have seen, is simply one that we have chosen, riches, happiness, and so on. So what is the goal of a categorical imperative? Whatever it is, as we have also seen, it cannot be something chosen. It must rather be a worthy goal in and of itself. But the only thing like this, Kant continues, is the rational being. Indeed, people are always worthy as motives for action in and of themselves. We can therefore formulate the categorical imperative this final and third way. We ought to act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the persons of another, never simply as a means, but always at the same time, as an end. This, then, brings us to the end of Kant. I am sure that many of you are happy. Personally, I'm sad. No, actually, I'm sort of happy too. This said, I hope that Kant did teach us something, if not how to act, then at least how Kant thought we should act. Because whether we agree with him or not, he still undeniably structures the way many people think about ethics. Every time we hear someone say, well, at least his heart was in the right place, or I did it because it had to be done, we've got a Kantian on our hands. And perhaps now, after reading him, you too have joined the rank of these noble Kantians.